Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. My name is Sarah Pacina, and I'm the Development Officer for the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. And this is actually my first time hosting one of these events, so I'm super excited. And we have Jen Curl from ADF&G today. She's going to talk about rats and how they're not native to Alaska, but some of the strategies that she's worked on in the past. So I wanted to be able to give an introduction to AWA and to this call, to this talk. And you are recording, so you'll be able to see this presentation afterwards, either on our website at www.akwildlife.org, which we'll put in the chat, or on our YouTube station. Just a couple of notes about virtual engagement. So we are going to try to avoid Zoom bombing. We encourage all of you to watch this presentation in full screen, which is at the bottom of should be at the bottom of your screen to click on. My dog is barking in the background, I'm sorry. As Nikki said, if we have to, we encourage the cameras are off just to preserve bandwidth. And we're gonna wait for questions to the end of the presentation with Jen, but you please feel free to pop those into the chat and we will moderate those at the end. And most important is to enjoy and learn something new. And just so quickly about AWA, we've been an organization since 1978. We are a member of the Pick, Click, Give, as well as CFC, which is the federal giving program, and then Amazon Smile. We were formed by Alaskans for Alaska's wildlife, and really our mission is to provide a voice for the animals, the wildlife in Alaska. We want to say a special thank you to the Southeast chapter for hosting these Wildlife Wednesdays on the first Wednesday of every month, I believe. So our Southeast chapter, represented by Tommy Johnson, Linda Shaw, Irene Morris, and Pauline Strong. We encourage you to visit our website to kind of learn more about what we're doing and our work, our most recent work. We always have our news up, as well as some of the ways that you can get involved and a little bit of work on our advocacy. You can learn more about the species in Alaska that are done by, we had some really great interns pull up these species spotlights for us. And if you're not a member, we encourage you to become a member. And our Southeast chapter is pretty active, working on the Juneau Bear Committee, the Pinniped Entanglement Group, and the Southeast Otter Stakeholder Group. We also do a lot of other things. We've been really active protecting the wolves down there as well, and a lot of other things. But please visit our website, learn more, or just drop us a line in the chat box, and we're happy to link you up as we can. Also, you can subscribe to us and get our newsletter. We promise we won't send you a whole lot of stuff, so please feel free to sign up on our website. And again, we just want to say thank you so much for coming, and really excited to have you this evening. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jen. So thank you very much. Just trying to stop my share.
Okay. So. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to AWA for having me. Let me share my screen here. All right, can you see my presentation, Sarah? All good? Okay. Hi, my name is Jen Curl, and I'm a wildlife educator at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And I really jump at the chance to talk about this topic. It's one that's really important to me. I spent a huge phase of my life engaged in this issue, and it's one that a lot of people don't know a lot about. And rats were actually the reason that I first came to Alaska. So I went to college in Santa Cruz, California, and started volunteering with a coastal conservation lab and a nonprofit that collaborated with them that focused on coastal ecology and also removing invasive species from islands. And so I started in the tropics on a trip in 2005, and my first trip to Alaska was in 2006. And then I moved up here in 2008 to work on the project that I'll talk a lot about. And I was hooked, and a lot of it was because of this particular work. So to back up and to give a little bit of introduction, what do we think of as introduced species? We think of them as species that expand outside their natural range, usually because they move with humans rather than dispersing through natural means like flying, swimming, being blown with the wind, or drifting on current. And introductions happen a variety of ways. Humans might bring species on purpose or by accident. You know, we've introduced caribou and reindeer to ADF, for instance, to support a military base, which is out in the Aleutians. And we've introduced plenty of plants, some of them to be forage species and some of them accidentally. But how do we determine when a species becomes invasive? And it's generally when they cause serious harm to native species and ecosystems. Maybe because where they're introduced, there's a lack of a natural predator, or there might be a lack of a competitor that keep them in check, or the environmental conditions really benefit them. But all of the classic examples of invasive species you can probably think of, and there's lots, brown tree snakes, zebra mussels, European green crabs, are notorious for the damage that they do, and rats are definitely in that category. So how did rats get to Alaska? The main answer is by boat. So the first image is Rat Island, which I'll talk a lot about tonight. And it was the first island that we know of that rats got to Alaska. They came from a Japanese fishing vessel that ran aground in the late 1700s. And rats arrived in Alaska in the 1840s, but most rats reached ports throughout Alaska in the 1940s at the height of military and cargo traffic during World War II. And since then, shipping traffic has only increased, so there's still a threat often from shipping traffic and rats coming from other places aboard vessels. But rats can also arrive in other ways. They can come many ways that people do. So they could get on a plane, they've been found on a barge or stowed away in cargo containers, and people have brought them to Alaska by car as pets. And so, but the main way that the main mechanism that we're concerned about, especially in future introductions, is mostly by boat. So where are rats in Alaska? The yellow dots are cities, towns, and villages with known breeding populations of rats. There's an asterisk by Fairbanks because there was an infestation in the landfill at some point, but right now there's no current evidence of a breeding population. The red polygons are large islands that have rats, and there are also many other small islands near those large islands or that didn't make it onto this map that have rats. I want to point out, so a lot of my talk tonight will focus over here on the Western Aleutian. So if you can see Amchitka Island, in between Amchitka and Kiska Island, which both have rats, there's one little dot, and then, well, two little dots, but the closest to Amchitka is Rat Island, and it's no longer red because rats were removed, and we'll definitely talk about that. So what invasive rodents are of concern? As an educator, it makes me really happy when I find other outreach products that are wonderful. So this chart came from the government of British Columbia. These are the three that concern us the most. I am mentioning Tanazumi and Exelons because they exist in the Pacific and they're invasive other places. And it is potentially possible that they could get to Alaska, but they would likely have a harder time surviving here because they're more tropical or temperate species. So we have documented cases of black rats in Alaska ports. And there are also established populations of house mice in several urban areas in Alaska. But the one that we're really concerned about is Norway rats. And that's what I'll focus on mostly today, because Norway rats do really well in cold climates and in places like Alaska. So they're dominant in Europe and they're dominant on subarctic islands, like we'll talk about tonight. And they have gotten to islands and they have become established and have populations that are successful on islands outside of urban population centers. So other places, the other species we have kind of a hard time surviving outside of urban areas, because one thing we have in Alaska is a lot of wild space and predators and severe weather. So black rats do better in tropical areas also, and house mice and black rats both have a hard time surviving outside of urban areas. Norway rats have been particularly successful on remote and uninhabited islands. So this was my first trip to Rat Island in the Western Aleutians, that oldest population of rats that we know about, in 2007. And the thing that struck me, this is a beach on the south side of the island, was that all the tracks you can see where two people have walked here as we walked down the beach, but all the other tracks that you can see belong to rats. And the sheer number of rat tracks that outnumbered bird tracks on the coast really made an impression on me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts rats have on humans and human areas. And then I'm going to focus most of the talk on the impacts to wildlife, both direct and indirect impacts to ecosystems. So it's worth mentioning that rats aren't great for humans. They carry many diseases, leptospirosis, hantavirus, and they're famous for the plague, among others. And there is such a thing called rat bite fever, which is a bacterial infection. But as far as we know, in Alaska, rats, there hasn't been any cases of rat to human disease transmission. But they can consume and contaminate crops and human food, and they often contaminate way more than they can actually consume, and do a lot of damage that way, especially in other places. And they can damage infrastructure. I was just told a story tonight about rats damaging a phone line on Shemia Island on the military base there. So we do occasionally have rat damage to human infrastructure, but I would argue that the biggest and most detrimental impacts of rats in Alaska have been on wildlife, particularly on islands. So a little bit of background about why we might care about islands. So islands are important because they're a small amount of landmass globally, but they represent a disproportionate amount of biodiversity. So a disproportionate amount of species of birds, reptiles, and plants, of endangered species, and particularly of extinctions. And a lot of that is due to endemism, or species that only occur on one or a few islands. And fun fact, this upper right-hand corner is an endemic plant only found on 2 islands in the Aleutians, and that's one of my photos from a trip out there. And so islands are really special places that have unique species. And one of the reasons we care about islands in this case is 80% of the islands globally have rats. So rats in general are a huge problem beyond Alaska, across the world. So when we talk about direct impacts to wildlife, the wildlife on remote islands in the Aleutians and other parts of Alaska are home to seabirds. And I did my master's work on seabird populations, and I won't talk about that tonight, but the impact of seabirds on ecosystems became particularly apparent to me. They're apex marine predators, so they exert force on marine ecosystems, and they also are indicators for us, especially, to know what's going on in the ocean. They also bring marine nutrients to terrestrial ecosystems. And Alaska is a really special place for seabirds because the coastal areas of Alaska host tens of millions of breeding seabirds of more than 30 species. So transitioning to, and this photo I wanted to point out is Kiska Island in the Western Aleutians, and it's one example of the large islands in the Aleutians that house millions of seabirds. This one island actually houses millions of seabirds by itself, particularly least and crested auklets, which you see up there in the upper right. And it is an island that got rats during World War II, and there are rats actively in the seabird colonies on Sirius Point and on Kiska Island. So when we talk about direct impacts that rats have on wildlife, they consume anything that sort of overlaps with their territory. They're omnivorous and they scavenge, and they can eat just about anything. So they'll eat eggs and chicks and adults. And they also cache. So they'll cache for winter, particularly in the Aleutians. So these were auklets found in burrows, in just one or a couple of burrows on Kiska Island. But I do want to take a moment to say that rats are also amazing critters. They're really detrimental, but they're really good at what they do. So they can adapt to almost any environment they live in, and they reproduce once every 4 weeks, which will become important later. And so when you get rats on an island the size of Kiska, which is many thousands of acres, you end up with thousands and thousands and thousands of rats. So one of the reasons that island species are vulnerable to invasive predators is, well, one, in the Aleutians, as you can see from some of my photos, there aren't a lot of trees. All of the areas that any wildlife can get to, any birds can get to, rats can also get to. And the areas that seabirds like, and coastal birds, shorebirds and sea ducks and other things that use these islands, are the places that rats like. So rats concentrate along the ocean. They can eat out of the intertidal in the winter. They can eat birds. And one of the reasons that that's so devastating is that island species often evolved without the presence of predators. So they don't have natural defenses to something like attacks from rats. And I'm going to show a video. It is a little bit graphic, as warning. So if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to. But it's the best possible example I could give you of what that looks like. So this is Go Island in the South Atlantic. And these are house mice that have been established for a really long time. So they're bigger and they're pretty aggressive. So I'll let this play. So albatross are pretty large for seabirds. Even their chicks are fairly large, as you'll see in comparison in a moment to mice. But naturally, they probably evolved in this ecosystem without having to defend themselves from predators ever. So in this video now you can see house mice and you can see the chick, and you'll just notice that the chick can't really defend itself. It doesn't seem to really know how. And there's lots of cases documented of chicks actually being eaten alive by multiple mice. And I won't play this for too long, but I do think it is the clearest example I could give of why seabirds are particularly not evolved to deal with this type of predation. Okay, so besides direct impacts of directly consuming wildlife in the Aleutians, rats also have indirect impacts on ecosystems, and I'm going to give you two examples. The first is a grad student that I worked for as an undergrad. She did her PhD focused on rats and Aleutians, and one part of her work focused on looking at the community structure of islands with rats and without rats across the Aleutians. So she measured intertidal systems across various islands across the Aleutian chains. And in a regular ecosystem without rats, you have large populations of coastal birds, sea and shorebirds, and a lot of them consume grazers in the intertidal, so things like limpets and urchins, other things that eat algae. And so because these birds are exerting pressure on the grazers, you get systems that are that have healthy algae populations. And what happens when you introduce rats and you deplete those coastal bird populations is you release pressure on those grazers, and you actually get systems that are devoid of algae or have significantly less algae. She documented this pattern across the Aleutians. She measured 8 islands with rats and 15 without rats. And this was clear from intertidal sampling. And I'll come back to sort of the methods of the sampling later in the talk. So that's one example of a trophic shift, an indirect impact of rats influencing the entire ecosystem. This is another Aleutians example, but there's a very similar example in subantarctic islands in New Zealand. And so in this case, we're looking at a terrestrial ecosystem, and in a healthy predator-free ecosystem, you have a healthy populations of seabirds that bring marine nutrients from guano to island ecosystems, which fertilizes terrestrial plants, this thick, rich coastal grass, which feeds herbivores and predators. And when you introduce something like a rat or a fox, so in this case, it was foxes. The comparison was between foxes, islands with foxes and islands without, but many of the islands with foxes also had rats. What you ended up with was a disappearance of seabirds and those nutrients from guano, and a shift in the ecosystem to a completely different kind of terrestrial plant system that did not feed herbivores and predators nearly as much. So those are two cases where invasive predators can completely shift the composition of ecosystems. So we talked about impacts to humans, direct impacts on wildlife, and indirect impacts to ecosystems. And now I want to focus on sort of what do we do about this problem of invasive rats, especially when you're talking about seabird colonies with millions of birds that are impacted. What are the potential options? And with any invasive species, there are sort of 3 options. One is preventing it from ever getting there, and that's clearly the cheapest and most effective way to handle invasive species, but it's often not an option. The second is control, which is depressing or suppressing, limiting the population of an invasive species in order to lessen the impacts. And what I'm actually going to talk about first is eradication. And eradication is the complete removal of an invasive species. And islands are important because they provide semi-closed systems. So if you remove every individual from an island, you actually have the chance of letting that ecosystem recover and eliminating the invasive species entirely. And I do have to preface this by saying I worked for this organization from 2005 to 2010, and so I no longer represent island conservation. And so I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the eradication because it's important to the rest of the talk. But eradication science is its own field and could be its own talk. And it would be better presented by somebody from island conservation, but I'm going to tell you how this fits into the rest of the story. So a little bit about rodent eradication. So every successful eradication has involved some kind of toxic bait. So the problem with rodents and how good they are at spreading and expanding their populations is you get hundreds and thousands of them. And so there's almost no way, unless the island is really small, to trap or remove individuals or the whole population any other way than to actually expose them to something that will remove, that will expose the entire population at once and get it basically between reproductive events. So rats reproduce every 4 weeks, which means that for Norway rats, for an eradication to be successful, you have to eliminate the entire population before new individuals can start to be added that weren't exposed to the bait. And so there's sort of three main methods that eradications have occurred. One is bait stations, which work on really small islands, where you can have stationary stations that attract rats to them. There's hand baiting, a spreading of some kind of toxic bait. And then there's the aerial broadcast of bait, which I will tackle that a little bit more in a minute. And this graph on the right is from a paper in 2007 that just basically shows that with the development of aerial baiting, eradications on islands have been able to be much larger, and islands that are much bigger and more complex have been able to have rodents removed from them. So in 2008, there was an eradication on Rat Island. I worked for Island Conservation, and I was part of both the biological monitoring, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also the logistics and eradication piece of the project. So Rat Island is about 7,000 acres. When the eradication occurred, it was the third largest eradication that had been attempted. And what I mainly want to say is that years of research went into logistics and development of the eradication methods. And we had dozens of permits that were required from federal and state agencies before the project was allowed to proceed. And it could be a talk in and of itself. So it was timed, we did the eradication in late September and early October of 2008. And it was timed to occur when resources for rats, food resources, start becoming scarce. So vegetation is dying off and senescing in the fall. Migratory birds are leaving, and there is basically a higher incentive for rats to take the bait. So aerial broadcast of a bait happens with a bucket underneath a helicopter, and there's a spreader on the inside that sort of propels bait out the sides and blankets the area. So it occurred in the fall of 2008. That island was monitored for 2 years afterwards, and it was declared successful in 2010. And if you followed this story at all, if this is the first you ever heard of it, then you might not know. But if you followed the story at all, you'll know that one thing that was part of the eradication is there was some non-target take, mostly birds that had scavenged on rats that had deceased. So most rats feel sick, climb in their burrows, and end up dying underground, but there are some that remain above, that die outside of their burrows. And so there were some birds that scavenged on rats that had passed away. And it was unfortunate and anticipated. Like I said, it was time for a time when migratory birds were thought to be not present on the island, or at a minimum. But I would add just a few things from my own perspective, not speaking for any of the organizations involved. One is the greatest risk in eradication is that you miss a rat. And we were successful on that front. So we are now 15 years past the original, well, 14 and a half, and the island is still rat free. Non-target effects were mostly on bald eagles and glaucous winged gulls. Both have shown signs of recovery, and were not population level impacts, and neither were endemic to that part of the Aleutians. And the third is just that every eradication is different, every island system is different, and each is an experiment. And so this slide shows you the size of Rat Island compared to the other islands in the Aleutians that have rats. And what to note here is that it's really a trial for a bigger, more complex island like Kiska, which is the eventual goal is to remove rats from islands with large breeding populations of seabirds. And it allowed managers to learn a lot about what to do in the future should this work progress. So, and then what I come back to and what I think about a lot is that every summer there's still rats out in those colonies on Kiska Island. And so I hope to see eradication progress in the future, because I get to share with you now some of the results from what has happened on the island and in the ecosystem post eradication. So one of the best parts of my job was the ecosystem research and monitoring. And it was everything from point counts for passerines to acoustic monitoring for bird species we couldn't directly detect, to beach transects across all parts of the island, measuring terrestrial vegetation, intertidal species, ptarmigan surveys, circumnavs of the island to monitor marine mammals. And we really got a sense of what was happening in the ecosystem before and after. And so one of the things that struck me first in 2009, I showed you this image at the beginning of all the rat tracks in 2007. And this isn't a perfect post picture. And I wish my younger 20-something self had taken the exact same photo again for comparison. But the entire beach, that mile-long beach, had nothing but bird tracks on it in 2009. And it was particularly striking. So a few things to share about shifts in the ecosystem after the eradication. So we had a paper that came out in 2015 that shared the results of some of the post-eradication monitoring. So we did point counts randomly distributed across the entirety of the island. And what I particularly want to point out is the two coastal species of songbird, which is the Pacific wren and song sparrow, both increased after post-eradication. And song sparrows are a special case because in all of the monitoring we did for the 2 years before the eradication, we never saw a song sparrow on the mainland of Rat Island. Song sparrows are widespread across the Aleutians, but it's thought that rats had been on Rat Island long enough and overlapping in the same territories that song sparrows like, and so we had never detected one in any of the surveys that we had done. So song sparrows returning was a really big deal. I mentioned acoustic monitoring, so we picked up that same increase in song sparrows on acoustic monitoring, and post eradication we had additional acoustic units and were able to detect Leach's storm petrel, which is a burrow nesting seabird, and we never in all of our surveys came across any signs of breeding seabirds, particularly burrow nesting species that would overlap with rat territories on the island. So that was also encouraging, especially only 5 years post-eradication. And all of this is passive recovery, just the ecosystem actually shifting after the eradication without humans doing anything to attract species back to the island. So I mentioned coastal birds. You can see that both black oyster catchers and glaucous wing gulls increased and beach transects and after post-eradication. And I mentioned eagles. So you can see the effects from the eradication in 2009, no breeding pairs or one non-territorial pair. But by 2013, there were 5 breeding pairs and 3 chicks again. So peregrine falcons, we never found chicks. And so there weren't very many, and they were likely not very impacted by the eradication at all. But it was encouraging that 5 years post-eradication, eagles were breeding on the island again. All right, so that was a little bit 5 years after eradication about how the bird communities were recovering. This is going back to the story of how the intertidal systems are impacted by rats. So this paper came out in 2021, so just recently. And as a reminder, so when rats are present, they decrease these coastal bird populations, which allows grazers to become more numerous and deplete kelp systems. So both pre and post eradication, we monitored those coastal bird populations, like I mentioned, walking beach transects, and we did intertidal plots. And in the green, you can see all of the beach transects we walked. There were 16 of them, and you can see they cover a pretty broad swath of the island. And we did all of them 4 or 5 times on each visit. And then intertidal surveys were at 8 different beaches, and there was a high and low at 2 different places on each beach. So It was quite a bit of photo analysis, and we overlaid grids on these photos and basically counted percent cover using a grid system of all of the following groups of species. So this graph shows change both in the 5 years after eradication to 2013 and then post all the way to 2019. And so the dark blue is the change from over the whole period, and the light blue is the change over the first 5 years. So what I want to point out here is that, so to remind you, if you remove rats and there are more of these coastal bird populations, which this graph here shows percent change. So to the right means an increase, to the left means a decrease. So both gulls and oyster catchers as representatives of coastal birds increased, some in the 5 years post-eradication and a lot in the 11 years post-eradication. They exert pressure on those intertidal grazers. And so you see decreases across many of those species, isopods, limpets, mussels, sea stars, snails, and urchins. And as a result, you would expect an increase in algae, which you can see up here in the fleshy algae category. And so it's been really amazing to see in a fairly short amount of time in terms of ecology, what removing rats can mean for an ecosystem. So just to summarize so far, Norway rats are on several large remote islands in the Aleutians, important to seabirds due to shipping traffic, shipwrecks, and World War II ship traffic over the past several centuries. Rats have negative impacts on both individual native species and whole ecosystems. And eradication is difficult, complex, and expensive, but ecosystem recovery is possible if rats are completely removed. So going back to this slide that you saw before, I talked about eradication, and I wanted to touch just a bit on prevention and control. So prevention, keeping rats from becoming established in new places. There's ADF&G has done quite a bit of work. We produced a rat management plan to help provide resources to communities and entities to help prevent future invasions and to raise awareness and to give resources, especially in places where rats exist. There are fish and game laws and regulations to help prevent future invasions and make rat violations and invasions enforceable. Communities have created ordinances to keep rat-infested ships from coming into ports, especially in places like the Pribilofs with huge populations of seabirds. And many communities have rat spill kits to be able to quickly respond if there is a new invasion, including things like our Walrus Island State Wildlife Refuge has a rat spill kit should rats get there by boat when dropping off people or gear, because it's an important place for seabirds in addition to being a refuge for walrus. And then just to touch on control. So control is suppressing rat populations where they already exist to lessen their impacts. And it is really important in those places on the map I showed you in the beginning that have established populations of rats. So I'll show you where these rat resources exist on our website in a little bit, but there are resources for waterfront facilities to help know how to respond and suppress populations from baiting and trapping. And there's also lots of resources provided to agencies and organizations partner together to do outreach and provide resources to vessels to help keep them rat-free and to respond to any new potential invasions. And in this photo, you can see rat guards on a boat so that if ships do have to come into ports with rats, there are ways to prevent rat infestations from happening. But one thing I'll say about control, so trying to suppress populations without removing them entirely, is it's forever. So it is maybe less expensive on an annual basis, but it something that kind of has to occur ongoing as a, you know, as a forever exercise in order for it to be effective. So just a couple of things to touch on at the end here. How can you help? Well, you're attending a talk about this, so raising awareness is a big part of it. Knowing Alaska regulations about rats and keeping pet rats, for instance. You may or may not know that albino rats are the only rats allowed in Alaska, so full white fur and pink eyes. And there are local ordinances like in Anchorage, which is a rat-free port, that no rats at all are allowed. So make sure you know not only state regulations, but ordinances where you live. Report sightings to us. We really want to know if you think you see a rat, especially if it's in a place where they're not established. Take photos with a ruler because that helps us figure out what species it might be and confirm if it's a rat or not. Collect samples, meaning if you find one that has passed away, if you can. And I would just say be aware of transiting between ecosystems, especially if you live in a place with rats and you happen to have a boat. And it's kind of a bigger thing for invasive species in general, is being aware of what you bring with you when you move between environments and being careful not to bring something that doesn't belong there. I think it's a general principle to strive for. So on our website, which I'll pull up here, there's a whole section dedicated to Norway rats with resources. So our management plan, the rat control for waterfront facilities, our regulations, and the penalties for them, if you're interested. I'm going to skip one slide for a moment. So please get in touch with us. If you have sightings or collections, you can call us, email us, or find all of these resources online. Make sure if you suspect you find something that might be deceased and might be a rat, wear gloves, take photos, several photos, tip to tail, and confirm with us that it's a rat. And there are folks, Link Olson at the University of Alaska Museum of the North, who are interested in collecting them. So if you get in touch with us, we'll help you figure out how to get it to them. And the last thing I will say is we get lots of calls about potential rat sightings that turn out to be native species. So I would say learn about the native species that might look like rats, that are the good guys, some of them being muskrat, meadow voles, deer mice, lemmings, and jumping mice. Although deer mice and jumping mice are really small, so less likely. But and I hope I've left plenty of time for questions. Sorry, it's a really big overview of a complex issue, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
So much, Jen. I think there is a couple of questions in the chat. So let me head on there, and other people, if you can want to drop questions in there, we'll get to them. Okay.
Thank you for the person that mentioned that Hawatha is the new name for Rat Island. Once it had been rat-free for enough years, it was given over to a council of folks to decide on what the name would be in it. They returned it to an Aleut name, which I should have used at the end of my talk. Sorry.
Very cool. Okay, there's one question here is, do invasive rats interbreed with muskrats?
What can you repeat?
Do the Norway rats interbreed with, or breed with muskrats?
Not that I'm aware of. Joe, do you know otherwise? I would think not.
No, I've never heard of that. So I would say no.
Okay.
So albino rats that I mentioned are actually Norway rats, and different versions of Norway rats can potentially interbreed. And like I mentioned, the only pet rats that are allowed are fully albino rats. And part of the reason for that is they are thought to be less likely to survive if they escape.
Okay. And so I think you covered this, but you did talk about the bird species that had died from eating poison rats. It was bald eagles, and was there any other birds
Glaucous wingles, yes,
Glaucous.
both of which have shown signs of recovery since then. And I know I only touched on that briefly. That's like a whole other presentation. And there are quite a few articles you can find if you're interested in more on that.
Okay, and how, so here's a good question. How do you know when rats arrived on an island? And are they mostly based on historical accounts, or how do you start seeing a new sort of infestation? Um, if you're not
Also,
there.
rat sign is, if you've seen it, it can be pretty evident if you find it. So the scat, the smell that rats have, if it's a place where there's people, often they're sighted. It's way more difficult if it's a remote place, right, that people don't go to very often. So a lot of the places that we know of that have rats, the military occupied or had some kind of facility during World War II. Kiska is that way, ADAC, and several of the other islands. So that's one of the ways that we know about it. There's also the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge does a lot of work across the Aleutian chain every summer. And so they visit lots of islands and they're always on the lookout for any signs of rats, especially if they happen to be close to an island that already has rats.
Okay. Do cruise ship ports have to worry about rats? And is there a statewide listing of where Norway rats live? And then a follow-up is, where did the Norway rats come from?
Joe, do you want to answer the cruise ship ports having to worry about rats?
Yeah, sure, I can address that. Yes, I would say absolutely they need to worry about rats. And hopefully most of the cruise ships use rat guards on their lines that tie them up to the docks. And of course, some of the ports that they go into in Southeast Alaska have pretty well-established rat populations in their port areas. So they definitely need to be worried about rats getting on cruise ships, as does any vessel that's going to tie up in a port. And then particularly if it's going to go to another port that doesn't have rats. As Jen mentioned, that's the big concern, is they pick them up in one port and go to another port that does not have rats and introduce them there.
Is it a pretty common thing for boats to have those guards on their lines?
I think some of the larger commercial vessels do, but most of my experience has been more in South Central, Homer, Seward, where we don't have rats. I haven't been down to too many of the ports in Southeast Alaska. Kodiak would be another one that has a healthy population of rats. I don't know if they typically use rat guards or not, but they should.
There are other ways that boats prevent rats from getting on. So ships may keep all doors closed and have, particular ways that they tie up. They also can set active traps. That's another way of discouraging rats from coming on board. And I know that like the research vessel for the refuge has pretty stringent things that they do when they're in port in the Aleutian Islands that do have rats, like ADAC.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure the port of Kodiak, which is run by the city, has a pretty good rat control program in their port facility there to try to reduce rats from getting on board.
Okay, and then kind of following on that, is there currently any effort ongoing to control the spread and increases on islands with ports in Alaska other than the Pribilof?
That's another one that Joe might not know better than me, but I think that there are a lot of efforts in any place that have rats to decrease the amount of rats in port facilities. So through active trapping and baiting. And but Joe, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, some of the things we did there to try to beef up the enforcement arm as well as the educational arm was make sure our regulations were in place that would give us the enforcement if we needed to. And it was probably about 10 or 15 years ago, the Board of Game adopted some new regulations that prohibited any vessel or any means of conveyance from entering Alaska, including Alaskan waters that go out 3 miles, from entering the either land or waters with rats aboard. And also if any facility, particularly land-based facilities, had any rats, were infested with rats, that are required to come up with a control or ideally eradication program. And then we did a lot of educational efforts to creating some manual for waterfront facilities for controlling the rats. And then just doing a lot of outreach, trying to convince facilities that had rats to do that control.
Great, thank you.
There's a question about a listing of where Norway rats live. That map that I showed of where rats are exists on our website, I believe. Yeah, it's in at least the Alaska Wildlife News Archives, which if you search rats on our webpage, it'll be the second or third thing that comes up. And so that was a listing of which areas have established populations of Norway rats for that question. And Norway rats did come to North America from Europe, and I don't think that there's one pathway for that, but a lot of them came with early explorers or fishing vessels, and they spread across, the northern parts of Asia also.
And the Norwegians, who were, renowned through history for being sailors and world travelers, were unfortunately pegged with the name of the rat. So that was kind of somewhat unfair to the Norwegians. Just another thing to point out about where rats occur in Alaska is they have been seen in many other places than what was on the map Jen showed. Places like Kotzebue occasionally get rats that come in, presumably on cargo there. And the people that have seen them there said oftentimes they have frostbitten ears and tails that are all kind of shriveled up and gnarly. And they probably don't survive the winters up there. They survive part of a winter and not the whole winter. We've also had rat reports come in from some of the small native villages on the lower Kuskokwim, presumably coming in with cargo. And those climates may also be just too much for the rats, but also in the smaller villages, there's probably not the urban infrastructure for those rats to survive a winter in as well. So yeah, there are lots of more areas where rats have been sighted, but presumably haven't become established.
And there is a question about how rats break open eggs. And I can tell you generally that rodent teeth have very distinctive incisors, and they have this orange enamel on the front of their incisors, and they have a softer enamel material behind. And basically the softer material wears down. So their front enamel on their incisors is really sharp. It's almost kind of like a knife that they sharpen on things that they gnaw on constantly. So they have very sharp teeth that allow them to break into eggs pretty easily, I think.
Great, wow, that's kind of gives me heebie-jeebies to
And
think
that's
about.
a rodent family characteristic. So if you look at the skull of any rodents, including all the native rodents we have, you'll find the same.
Okay, and then a final question we have is, what precautions or prevention measures does the Alaska State Ferry System take to control or prevent rats being moved from port to port?
Joe, do you know the answer to that?
Jenna, unless you know something, it's a really good question.
It is one.
And I don't know. Although it'd be good for us to reach out to the ferry system. I know, years ago when we developed the manuals and adopted or drafted those new regulations, we did reach out to the ferry system. We reached out to all the ports across Alaska, informing them of the new regulations and the availability of the manual for providing them information on how they can control and prevent the spread of rats. What the ferry terminals and the other ports did with all that information, we can't say for sure.
Great. So I guess another final question for me is, what could, besides reporting when folks see, is there anything else that people can do to help support? Maybe it's an advocacy front, or putting pressure on folks to different industry. Is there anything that people can do to help prevent rats establishing in any given area?
I mean, my simple answer to that as an educator is raise awareness to this issue, and the more complicated. I mean, it's difficult within agencies. So there was a formal partnership between lots of different entities for a long time, working on sort of stop rats and rat response kits. And part of what's happened over time is agency personnel is less than it used to be. And so the more awareness, the more people like the Wildlife Alliance and other partners spread the message and make it a priority, I guess, the better. And then, there's, I don't know, Joe, do you have something else to add to that?
No, but that's a really good point. It's just, as Jen highlighted, it's a really important issue, particularly in Alaska with our resources up here. And I think the more people know about it and are aware of it and can lend the political support to do something about it, so much the better. And then individually, we can all just be aware of it, that if we're moving things from one place to another, particularly if we live in a town or near a port that has rats, just be vigilant of whether any of your, boats or old RVs or vehicles you're moving, or, boxing up things. Just be aware of the fact that you could be moving rats from one place to another, and just be vigilant of that as you're, doing your activities.
And I would say that extends beyond rats to other invasive species. I've worked on invasive plants in the interior, and I've worked on mongoose in Hawaii, and a variety of different invasives over a little bit with green crabs. And I mean, knowing is a lot of the battle, and being aware is a lot of the battle, and then supporting, donating, political pressure, all those things to groups that are doing good work. And trying to respond to these issues, like Joe said.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us this evening and teaching us all more about this issue. If there's no other final questions, then we will say good night. But I also just wanted to let folks know that we do have Wildlife Wednesdays on a regular basis. This is our first for the new year, which is exciting. And I think it's next Wednesday. It's an in-person one in Anchorage at the Alaska Zoo. And then again, the Southeast ones are virtual, and they are the first Wednesday of the month. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and thanks again, Jen and Joe, and bid everyone a good night. Thanks all.
There was one more question, sorry,
Oh,
about
sorry.
Are there other invasive species, whether mammal or invertebrates like fleas, that are troubling? And I would just point you back to our website that has the set of invasive species for Alaska to check out and to know about. And then there's other great folks throughout Alaska working on, we have, the wildlife species, but there are other lists of wildlife, and then also fisheries and aquatic species, but there are some other wonderful folks working on plants. So the lists do exist, and they're long, so I won't try and summarize them.
All right. Thanks again.